In this lecture, we're going to talk about hominid origins and the anatomical adaptations that had to take place in order for us to become bipedal. Let's start by defining the term mosaic evolution. This is the idea that different systems, whether they're anatomical, physiological, or anything else, evolve at different rates, meaning that having a big brain doesn't necessarily mean that you'll become bipedal, or being bipedal doesn't necessarily mean that you'll have a big brain. So as we're looking at all these traits, keep in mind that they didn't necessarily all evolve at the same time. And in fact, when we look at the fossils that we have, we'll see they came up at different times. Basic overview of the types of characteristics we're going to be looking at are, in order for bipedality to occur, we'll see longer legs, shorter fingers and toes, a shortened pelvis. Eventually, we'll see that humans have very big brains. However, our hominid ancestors did not. We see a reduction in the size of our teeth overall, although our molar enamel tends to be relatively thick. And at around 2.5 million years ago, we'll see an increasing dependency on culture as we began to make stone tools. So here we have an example of a modern Homo sapiens, which is us. We can compare that to an early hominid. This would be something along the lines of, if you've heard of the fossil Lucy, who's an Australopithecine. Don't worry if that's unfamiliar, we'll get to it. But she was bipedal, and this is sort of a good representation of what her skeleton looked like. She also had, just like we do, a shortened pelvis, but her arms were relatively long, her fingers and toes were still relatively long, and she probably had a better climbing ability than we do today. Early hominids did not have much bigger brains than the Miocene apes that we talked about before, and they weren't too highly encephalized. Their teeth were bigger than ours are, but smaller than those of chimpanzees. And up until about 2.5 million years ago, there were no stone tools being produced that we found. So we can assume that they probably had comparable abilities to chimpanzees and possibly more, but we don't have any real evidence of that with these early hominids. If we compare them to a Miocene hominoid, which would be a Miocene ape, which would include chimpanzees, they're quadrupedal, the pelvis is longer, they have the ability to swing through the trees, they still have small brains relative to us, but large brains relative to monkeys. The teeth are bigger, and we don't see any stone tool use. We assume that they probably had abilities similar to chimpanzees, but we don't know for sure. So here we have a nice picture where you can compare all three of them and sort of just look at a couple of the skeletal differences. Now, specific modifications for bipedalism include the following: a lengthening of the hind limb, which we call the legs. The pelvis took on a shorter, more rounded shape. The femur angled inward. The femur is your thigh bone. The spine gained an increased curvature and became S-shaped. The big toe lined back up with the other toes rather than being opposable, and we start to see a longitudinal arch in the foot. And the foramen magnum repositioned itself, meaning it moved more anteriorly, more towards the face, right underneath the skull. It starts out in the back of the head, and this is the place where the spinal cord goes through to reach the brain. So let's take a look at some pictures and compare these. If we look at the arm and leg length ratios, what you'll see is that on modern humans, our arms are much shorter than our legs, whereas if we were to compare them to chimps, chimpanzees have very long arms. You can see with monkeys, they tend to have limbs that are the same length. You'll also note that the curvature of the spine is like a C, and that the spinal cord enters the skull right at the back here. So keep that in mind. The pelvis shape changes dramatically. When we become bipedal, our pelvis gets shorter and rounder and broader. So that bone called the ilium begins to flare outward. This is all in order to support the weight of your body on top of your pelvis. The femur angle changes shape based on the way that the muscles attach. What we see is that the femur, which is your thigh bone right here, actually angles inward because of its attachments instead of just going straight down. And if you look at a member of the genus Homo, which is our genus, you'll see that the femur, which is this bone right here, connects with the lower leg bone, which is the tibia, at an angle. The bone itself is angled. Australopithecines, like this one, A. afarensis, have the same angle. That tells us that they were bipedal as well. Whereas Pan, which represents chimpanzees, has no angle to the femur. Now you can see pretty clearly that as we became bipedal, we see a significant curve in the spine. It becomes S-shaped. We have a pelvic curve, a lumbar curve, a thoracic curve, and a cervical curve, all in response to the pressure of the body weight pushing down on the spine as we began to sit up and walk. If we compare the hands and the feet, you'll note that the chimpanzee has much longer fingers than the modern human does. Same thing with the toe. In addition, the big toe on the chimpanzee is not lined up with the foot, right over here, whereas in a human it has realigned, so it's no longer opposable. We also see the development of a longitudinal arch that runs the length of the foot, and the transverse arch, which runs from side to side. Now, as far as cranial anatomy, we see a lot of changes, and we're going to look at a couple of them more closely, but just in general, overall, the robusticity of the skull decreases with time, meaning that it becomes less thick and less robust, and the cranial bones get thinner. We eventually see lots of bony protrusions on the head begin to disappear, like a sagittal crest, which we'll take a look at in a moment. The foramen magnum, which is that hole underneath the skull where the spinal cord enters, changes position. The zygomatic arch, which is your cheekbones, they become smaller over time. Cranial capacity eventually increases, but I do want to stress that big brains were not a necessary result of being bipedal. Bipedalism, in fact, evolved millions of years before we ever see a big brain, so bipedality came first. We'll also see a reduction in the brow ridges over the eyes. We'll see a reduction in how prognathic the face is. That means how far the face sticks out from the rest of the skull. The shape of the jaw, the maxilla being the upper jaw, the mandible being the lower jaw, changes as well. And finally, with modern humans, we'll see a forehead and a chin. We don't actually see a forehead and a chin in any other hominids other than us. So if you look right here, you can see the position of the foramen magnum. It's right underneath the center of the skull, so suggesting the head is sitting right on top of the spine. If you were to compare that to a chimpanzee, you'll note that the foramen magnum is much more posterior towards the back of the skull, indicating that they're walking on all fours. Humans have an arc-shaped jaw, while apes have a U-shaped jaw. So humans have a parabolic shape and apes have a U shape. Here's a male gorilla where we can see a sagittal crest. This is an example of one of those bony features of the skull that we see in some of our earlier ancestors. Interestingly enough, we don't see it in the female mountain gorilla, in large part because the sagittal crest is not only associated with some primitive features, it's also associated with sexual dimorphism, where one sex looks different than the other sex, which, if you remember from the last unit, from the second portion of the course, we talked about how sexual dimorphism often arises in response to social pressures like mate competition. If we compare a modern chimp to a modern Homo sapiens, you'll see that the brain capacity is significantly different. You'll also see the forehead on the human. There's no forehead on the chimp. From the side, you can see the chimp has a much more prognathic snout than the human does. And you can also see that the human has a chin, while the chimpanzee, on the other hand, just has a receding jawline. It just goes straight back. And incidentally, the chimps tend to have thin enamel on their teeth and humans tend to have thick enamel. Now, how did we get to finding the fossils that gave us the information we have today? In order to figure that out, we sort of have to look at a very brief history of paleoanthropology as a field. Initially, anthropologists expected to find hominids that would have big brains with ape-like bodies. They assumed that you had to have a big brain in order to walk on two legs. In 1911, a skull was found in Piltdown, England, that they thought was perfect because it had an ape-like jaw with a human-like skull. It turns out it was a fake, and it was debunked in the 1950s as being the combination of an ape and a human skull. So it wasn't actually real. The debate was then on for, did humans evolve in Africa versus Asia? At this point, we know it's Africa, but we had different individuals doing research. Dubois was doing research in Asia, Dart was doing research in Africa, and in 1925 found the Tong child, which is an early hominid child that showed evidence of being completely bipedal with a small brain. So this was our first piece of information that told us that bipedality came before big brains. Louis Leakey and Mary Leakey are some of the biggest researchers in Africa in the 1950s, and they made a lot of spectacular finds in terms of tools and hominid remains that have led to the knowledge we have today. Now, all of this begs the question, why was bipedality selected for? Because there's no design here, but just over time we see that bipedality evolved. There's a lot of ideas and there's no perfect consensus, but some of the main ideas that we have right now is that bipedalism might be the most efficient form of locomotion on the ground for animals that are basically built to hang in the trees. So for an arboreal ape that had to cross open grassland, walking as a poor biped might have actually been more efficient than walking as an even poorer quadruped. So we might have seen selection favor improvements in bipedalism rather than shifting back towards quadrupedalism. It also helps with cooling or heat dissipation. In increasingly open grasslands, bipedalism might have helped prevent overheating because bipedalism holds the body vertical instead of horizontal. So the sun will strike a smaller fraction of the body when it's upright. Think about like sunburn on days when you're walking around versus sunburn on days when you're laying out at the beach. Also, when you stand up, you get the upper body away from the ground where the air temperature is generally lower and there's more wind that'll help cool the body. Another idea is that bipedalism freed the hands for carrying things like food from dangerous places to a tree where it could be eaten safely. The problem with this is that chimps can carry things in their hands pretty well even without being good bipeds. Another idea is that standing upright might be an efficient way to move on the ground while picking fruit from bushes and trees. Shuffling from one spot to another without having to drop to all fours between each spot could be a valuable skill. And also, standing upright gives you a better view of predators over the tall grasses in the savanna as you're moving between patches of trees. So all of these things might have led to selection for bipedality. So now that we have a pretty good understanding of the anatomical traits that are involved in being bipedal, let's look at some of our earliest bipedal fossils. Now, what we have here is at the end of the Miocene and the start of the Pliocene, somewhere between 6 and 8 million years ago, one of the surviving ape lineages started showing signs of bipedality. So this is the split that led to hominins. Hominins or hominids are the bipedal apes, basically. Initially, they weren't really different than apes, other than walking on two legs. So if we look, what we'll see is we call this group our basal hominids. So these are the earliest hominids. They're basal, like the base of something, not basil like the herb. So let's take a look at our three genera, Sahelanthropus, Auroran, and Ardipithecus. So what we're going to be looking at here is this very early period of hominid evolution. And in our next lecture, we'll get into the Australopithecines. But this just sort of gives you a nice overview of where we're starting at around 6.5, 7 million years ago, all the way up to 1 million years ago in the next lecture. I'm going to go through each species individually, but I want to give you an overall idea of the morphology or physical form of all of these early hominids. Their cranial capacity was low, so anywhere from 350 to 450 cc's. They had prognathic faces, and depending on which sample we look at, the foramen magnum was sort of in a transitional position. So it wasn't all the way back, but it wasn't all the way forward, suggesting definitely more time spent on two legs than the apes. They had large canines and a shearing premolar with a diastema. Diastema is a gap between the canine and the premolars to make room for the upper canine, so this suggests pretty big teeth. They also had thin enamel, which is a primitive trait. They had long arms and fingers, but the femurs that we found were biped-like, so again suggesting that they walked on two legs but still spent time in the trees. We have no evidence of culture, so no stone tools, so we assume that they probably had chimp-like abilities, but nobody can be sure. Our first specimen that we're going to look at is Sahelanthropus chadensis. It was found in Chad, Africa, and dates back to 6 to 7 million years ago. You take a look here, you can see him from the front, the side, underneath. We can get a look at this foramen magnum, and you can see that it's more anterior than it would have been in chimps, but still transitional. So again, suggesting that it was partly bipedal. The teeth are still ape-like, and the brain is still chimp-sized. So again, we very much have a partially bipedal ape with Sahelanthropus chadensis. Here's another look. And you can actually see just the beginnings of the sagittal crest that he probably had. You can also see the significant brow ridge right here. Now, Auroran tugenensis was another big find, which dates back to 6.1 to 5.2 million years ago and was found in Kenya. Some interesting features about it is that the head of its femur, which is the thigh bone, is very large, which suggests that it evolved under selection for durability in a creature that would spend lots of time on its hind legs, so suggesting that it's a biped. If this is correct, this would make Auroran an early hominid as opposed to a late ape. Its humerus, though, which is the upper arm bone, and one long curved finger bone suggests that it still had some features associated with hanging in the trees. And if we reconstruct the paleo environment by using other animal fossils, we can see that it was covered with grassland with small patches of forest. So this would be exactly what we would expect for an ape that's becoming a part-time terrestrial biped, an open grassland with some trees in between. If we take a look at where they were found, you can see right here it was found in Kenya. The next samples that we're going to look at are going to be found up here in northern Ethiopia. Ardipithecus cadava, which dates back to 5.8 million years ago, and Ardipithecus ramidus are our next big fossil specimens. The picture that you see here is a picture of Ardipithecus ramidus. Not a whole lot is known about Ardipithecus cadava because we just have a few teeth and some fragments. However, Ardipithecus ramidus probably descended from cadava, and we have a lot more information about that because we have a fossil that represents almost half of the whole skeleton. And this is the one that's nicknamed Ardi. So, you know, the Discovery show, Discovering Ardi. This is who they're talking about. It's still clearly an ape with a chimp-sized brain of around 350 cc's. The foramen magnum, though, is more forward and under the head in the other apes, hinting that it spent time in upright posture and was thus bipedal. But it still has a grasping big toe and a couple of other features that suggest quadrupedal motion in the trees. So we still think it spent a significant amount of time in the trees, even though it was definitely walking on two legs when it was on the ground. Interestingly enough, the males actually have canines that are only a little bit bigger than the females, so we don't see a lot of sexual dimorphism in Ardipithecus, a lot less than what we see in chimps or gorillas, which suggests perhaps that there was less male-male competition and maybe some other differences in social behavior. So we still don't know exactly what their social behavior was like, but we can get hints from all of this. Based on a reconstruction of their environment, we think that they lived in wooded areas of patchy woodland as well as grassland, and we can see this based on the seeds, the other animals that we find. And this is sort of our last basal hominid. You can see he's found right up here, just below where Lucy, a famous female fossil of Australopithecus afarensis, was found later. Actually, Lucy was found first, but she dates later. This is just a picture of Ardipithecus's teeth. You can see it has very thin enamel, primitive teeth, and you can see those canines, while they're bigger than ours, are not particularly huge. So this takes us to right around 5 million years ago, 4.5 million years ago, when we'll start to see our first early Australopithecines. So something I want you to keep in mind as we go through the next several lectures is, how are the traits changing? What is the transitions that are taking place that allow us to see the evolution of man? How can we trace this back through the traits that are visible?